the great admiration of the RSS for Nazi Germany and for Hitler. I mean, and it was, you must remember that this was, while the Holocaust was happening, there was great admiration for Hitler. And they've even written that in the way that they've solved the Jewish problem, we need to solve the Muslim problem.
The following is a discussion with Dr. Harsh Mander. Dr. Harsh is an Indian author, a researcher, a columnist, and a social activist. Dr. Harsh is the director of the Center for Equity Studies, a research organization based in New Delhi. His decades of work in social activism is an example for us all, and we're so pleased that we've been able to have this discussion with him. In this discussion, we'll discuss why Muslims live apart, its historical significance, the idea of India, and what it means to be targeted because of your religion. As always, we hope that you find this conversation insightful, and more importantly, we hope that it brings about real change. Dr. Harsh, firstly, I'd just like to thank you hugely for joining us. I know it's quite late in India, and I'm very, very grateful to be in your esteemed presence. So thank you so much for joining us at UK-IMC.
As we were speaking a little earlier, I'll be speaking to a lot of young second, third generation citizens of the UK and other countries, but whose parents, grandparents originated here. So it's a pleasure to talk to you.
So Dr. Harsh, one of the things that I read most recently was your article in Scroll, which you talked about why Indian Muslims live apart, and there was some sort of resonance with the UK. So recently, there's been a bit of a media splash around Muslim ghettos in the UK, believe it or not. So we've had members of parliament that have basically said it's like going to no-go zones. There are actual cities like Birmingham, which are totally Muslim, and non-Muslims aren't allowed to go there. One of the commentators on Fox actually said that if you actually go to these Muslim places, there's Muslim religious police that actually wound and seriously harm anyone that doesn't have the right dress code. And this is the kind of stuff that's being fed to the public.
Stereotyping and so on. And that's why I wrote this article after a great deal of research and thinking about why Muslims live apart. And it was precisely to respond to the stereotype. I mean, what I found was that, this assumption that Muslims wish to live apart among people of their own religious identity, don't want to mix, is actually mostly untrue. And I know India, so I can speak for India. And it's, they pushed into ghettos for 2 or 3 reasons. One is when there is communal violence, when there is religious violence, there's a sense that safety is in living with people of your own religious identity. So it's fear and violence that drives people here. But there's also something else. I mean, it's very hard, even for middle class Muslims to be able to rent or buy homes increasingly in mixed colonies. People sort of frankly turn them down, and there's a continuous sense of reminding or communicating who belongs and who belongs equally and who belongs less. And so Muslims live apart mostly because they're coerced into living apart.
Yeah, and I think one of the examples you gave was as early as 1947, the partition period, Delhi especially. There was a really interesting image that you shared actually around that time, a black and white photo of Muslims near Humayun's tomb, and intense. And essentially that's where then they were moved to these areas specifically to kind of protect themselves, and that's where they ended up staying. Do I understand that correctly?
Yes, Delhi, where I lived, was a remarkable story because at the time of independence, Muslims were about a third of the population, and the city belonged equally to them, and there were middle class and wealthy working class Muslims in the city. And within the 2 years, the tumultuous years of partition, the numbers came down to about 5%, and a large segments of the city got cleaned out of Muslims. Some part of it was Muslims who moved to Pakistan. And that's also a story. Why did they move to Pakistan? Was it a choice? Was it fear? Was it violence? And Mahatma Gandhi's, the last months of his life, Maulana Azad, Nehru kept telling Muslims in India that this is your country equally, it will always be. Maulana Azad very famously stood on the ramparts of the stairs of Jama Masjid in Delhi and said that this country belongs equally to you. He would say that I'm Indian and I'm Muslim, and both these identities are essential to me, and neither identity can be taken away from me.
Absolutely. One of the things that was new to me, and I'm ashamed to say this,
Right.
but I think that many people are in my situation in the UK as Indian Muslims that we don't necessarily know our past. And one of the things that you shared with us is within that 3 month period in 1947, there were 20,000 Muslims that were massacred.
Mm.
20,000. And we look at the Gaza crisis, it kind of gives us a bit of an idea as to what that may have looked like in a period of 3 months, right? And that's the
Yeah.
kind of longer, broader picture. Um,
The true
we,
story, the story of India's partition, it is estimated that 1 million people killed each other
wow.
during the months of partition, Hindu, Muslim, and Sikh. The trouble is that people on this side of the border recall the violence that they suffered, Hindus and Sikhs suffered in the hands of Muslims. People on that side of the border will recall the violence that they suffered in the hands of Hindus and Sikhs. And actually the story is that every community uh, a kind of madness
Yeah.
seized the subcontinent. My own family, incidentally, is from what is now Pakistan, near Rawalpindi, and they were among 14 million people who became lost their homes forever during partition on both sides of the border.
Wow. And I guess going on from that, and that, you stated that these may have been some of the reasons as to why that ghettoization, so to speak, occurred. Perhaps not the right use of the word. Um, but you'd also stated something which was really interesting to me. And you stated that the irony is that the law itself was being used against Muslims. So there was a law to protect Muslims from this, the Disturbed Areas Act in 1991, and that ended up being used against them. Would you care to elaborate on these issues?
Um, No, why they became ghettos also is because there's a clear and systematic denial of public services
Yeah,
in Muslim majority settlements. So when you go into these settlements, they look like ghettos because they don't have
yeah,
good roads, they don't have drainage, they don't have public services. But that's not how they chose to be.
yeah.
So that's one thing to remember. And as India transformed, I mean, I think the early decades of India in the shadow of the partition violence, but then Mahatma Gandhi's, continuous appeal and his assassination. He was lived for many ideas, but he died for the idea that Muslims are equal citizens in this country. And that is why a fanatic, Hindutva fanatic, assassinated him. And that battle actually, for the first decade or two of India's freedom, it looked like that matter was settled, that India, Muslims equally, and they felt part of India's nation building. And, in many ways, our poetry, our films, and the pop, I grew up, I was born about 8 years after independence. I grew up in an India where I wouldn't have dreamt of bigotry being spoken, in my family, in among my classmates. It was a very different kind of India, and then over later decades, it declined. The movement for the Babri Masjid in the 1980s was where matters deteriorated, and then. Uh, the state increasingly became part of this uh, project of pushing Muslims uh, into ghettos. And one part of it was actually a law was created in the state of Gujarat actually to protect people after communal violence because they were forced to, you know, you're a Muslim living in a Hindu majority area, there's violence, you feel you need to move out, and everyone knows that you're desperate, so people sort of push down the price and it's a distress
Yeah.
sale. So the objective was actually that you had to take the district officer's consent before the purchase was approved in these areas.
Yeah.
And that law is now being used to actually, if a Muslim wants to buy property in a Hindu majority area in what is called a disturbed area, an area which has seen sectarian violence, it will be used with exactly the opposite objective. And I speak about that as well in this article.
Yeah. Yeah. Um, Dr. Harsh, I wanted to tackle this question later, but now that you've mentioned it, I want to ask you this straight away because it's something that's perplexed me. You said you grew up and you wouldn't have dreamt of this level of bigotry, right? And you're seeing it now. This is a question that's always perplexed me is the nature of the human condition.
Right.
That evil almost becomes bureaucratic, right? I know that we have the same sort of passion for Hannah Arendt. I know you mentioned her a few times as well. Um, but it is that kind of the human condition, almost, the bureaucratic nature of evil itself that we're seeing institutional hatred. Um, why do you think that is? Why do you think, or is it true? It's something that's perplexed me about India right now.
See, and because I'm conscious that I'm speaking to some of the people who would be listening to this discussion would be young people who are not familiar with, who haven't grown up in this land.
Yeah,
Um, India's freedom struggle, led by Mahatma Gandhi, it's really important to remember, was not just a battle against British colonialism. It was always, under his leadership, also a battle about what kind of country we would build after the British left, who would it belong to, who would it not belong to, and on what terms. And central to that idea, which we still call the idea of India itself, was that we would build a country where it would not matter whether you would worship this God or that Allah or you don't worship any. It would not matter what language you speak, what caste you belong to, what your gender is. You would be a fully equal citizen of this country that we would build. And it would be, I like to think of it as a belonging without conditionalities. When I go to Europe, I spent many months a few years ago looking at Nazi Germany and trying to understand what's happening in my own country. And and I saw even in Germany, which has tried very hard to deal with its with the cruelties and the Holocaust of its recent history. Even there was a sense that you have to qualify to belong to Germany. You must know the German language. You must know what they saw as German culture. In a sense, there was a conditionality to belonging.
yeah,
And although Germany now has about almost a quarter of the country is of immigrant background, as they say, large part of them are Muslim. But if I and I would ask very progressive friends in Germany, is Islam part of the German nation? And they almost fall off their chair in sort of in consternation that I could even suggest this. Whereas in India, as we had imagined it uh, as Gandhi and Nehru and Maulana Azad uh, and Sardar Patel and all our freedom fighters had imagined, and also people who were not followers of Gandhi, they Bhagat Singh, Subhash Chandra Bose, who who didn't agree with him on the question of non-violent resistance. But on this idea, they were all in agreement. uh, Baba Sahib Ambedkar, that India would be a country where you would have the freedom to be yourself, to live your life in the way that you choose to worship, the way you choose to dress, to speak the language, to eat, to love, if I might say, who and what, according to, and you'd have all of those freedoms and you would belong equally. So this is what we call the idea of India. Uh, but a large part of Indians, Hindu, Muslim, Christian, Sikh, uh, it was not important that Gandhiji believed in this, but that the large majority of Indians believed and followed this. Uh, but not everyone did. And there was, uh, in fact, this year, 2025, we complete 100 years of the RSS. It was formed 100 years ago, exactly in 1925. And the RSS, the Hindu Mahasabha, said no, India is a country that belongs primarily to its Hindu citizens. And in particular, they identified Muslims and Christians as people of non-belonging to this country. And because and the argument that they gave was that uh, their motherland is here, but their sacred land is outside the boundaries of this country, and therefore they belong less or they don't belong, and that Muslims and Christians can live in India only as second-class citizens. So there was the conflict of these two very, very different ideas for this country. And after the 1940s, the Muslim League grew. And the Muslim League was the third stream, which said that Muslims uh, cannot uh, cannot be assured of justice, equality, safety, unless they build a country where all or most people are Muslim. So, in a sense, you see, we have multiple identities. I mean, you have multiple identities. I have multiple identities. My religious identity is one of multiple
Yeah.
identities. But what what uh, what we call a communal ideology privileges only one identity. So you're defined by your religion. And then the idea of Pakistan was that there's safety only in samenesses. I'm safe only when I'm with people like me, as defined by my religion. The idea of India was don't look for samenesses, learn to respect difference. And so these are really important. I mean, there were these three streams. When India became free, and it's a long story, the Muslim League pressed, and in the end, the British left not one country but two countries, which finally became three countries. When they said that there would be a Muslim Pakistan, the RSS and the Hindu Mahasabha, and recall a time again where 1 million people slaughtered each other in the
Yeah.
in one of the worst. Imagine, and women were abducted. 14 million people were uprooted from their homes, which is the largest displacement in human history, apart from the movement of Africans as slaves to the Americas. So think of a cataclysmic moment like this. Train loads full of corpses were going on both sides. In and I spoke about my own extended family when they came as refugees, having lost their country and their home amidst unbelievable violence. There was anger, and therefore they were driving out or seeking to drive out Muslims from places like Delhi. And Gandhiji spent the last, I mean, uh, it was the most painful period of his life, but I also find it the most glorious moment of his life, where he went. He wasn't in Delhi in 15th August to celebrate India's freedom. He was in Calcutta trying to stop the violence there, and then he went on this long fast, and nobody believed that violence of that scale could end. And Lord Mountbatten said what my 55,000 armed soldiers could not do in Punjab, this one man with his moral courage, persuaded, and violence came to an end. Then he came to Delhi. He was planning to go to Pakistan, but in Delhi he found so much anger and violence, and he kept going. There were slaughters of Muslims in many parts, and the Mewati population, for instance, Mewat is close to Delhi, and there was, I think, 40, 50,000 Mewatis were killed, and they believed that they had no place to go except Pakistan. And Gandhiji, they still recall. I mean, I go there, and they celebrate. They say on December 19th, 1947, Gandhiji came and said to us, "This is equally your country. Don't go." And then we decided not to go. So all of that happened, and it culminated in the assassination of Mahatma Gandhi. And I think that is what stunned the country. You ask what's happened today, and why. Uh, it's 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 important to remember that much of India believed in the idea of what I would call a kind, equal, just country that we had promised ourselves, and we wrote also into our constitution, where everybody had the freedom to follow their religion and way of life and belong equally. But the RSS never accepted this, and uh, and they have, it's a long history, and it would take me many hours to tell us where the decline happened. We must remember, one thing that I'd like to underline: the great admiration of the RSS for Nazi Germany and for Hitler. I mean, it was, you must remember that this was, while the Holocaust was happening, there was great admiration for Hitler. And they've even written that in the way that they've solved the Jewish problem, we need to solve the Muslim problem.
Yeah.
Now, uh, a long history, the Babri Masjid movement, which maybe people know about or not, but there's not enough time to talk about it. But India, from about the late 80s, 90s, uh, began to transform. And increasingly, the RSS pushed this alternative. They never accepted the constitution. They never even flew the Indian flag for about 50 years on the RSS headquarters, because it symbolically has equal, saffron, white, and green. They never accepted that idea of equal belonging. Uh, and the tragedy for people who are proud of an idea that was important not just for India but for the world. Uh, and now we have the Prime Minister and every person in the highest constitutional positions elected are people who spent their lives, had lives in the RSS,
Yeah.
and they have a different imagination. And people like me, not just India's Muslims, but people who believe in that idea of an India which is kind, equal, and just for people of all faiths, that we are battling to reclaim that idea of India. It's also important to remember that Mr. Modi got elected with 33% of the vote share. I mean, in the strange system of first past the
Yeah.
post. Even at their peak, they were about 38, 39%, which still means that 60% of India, even with this degree of radicalization, do not accept uh, the RSS Hindutva imagination of a country that only belongs to its Hindu, caste Hindu citizens, where other people are second class citizens. And that battle is unfolding. Uh, just to illustrate a little bit, my parents are from a place called Kahuta in Pakistan, and Kahuta is sort of almost memorialized as one of the most brutal places of massacre during the partition time. And it was a place where, when the mobs came finally, and the Hindus and Sikhs were taking protection in a Gurdwara, and the mobs came, they said we have to save the honor of the women by making them jump into the well and killing themselves. And uh, men in the family actually were known to actually kill the women who refused to jump in. So, I mean, I'm just saying there's a terrifying history, which on both sides, everybody has suffered, and we've sort of, unlike the Germans, we've sort of pushed it away, we've sort of repressed it, we don't confront it. And in 2002, Gujarat saw a terrifying massacre. Mr. Modi, who's now the Prime Minister, was the Chief Minister in Gujarat. I was an IAS officer, I was a senior civil servant, and I went as a citizen to do to help the victims, to work in the relief camps. And in a very short time, I realized that this was not a riot, this was a state-sponsored massacre. And I spoke out, I wrote about it, and I quit my position in the senior civil service in protest. And I've been fighting since then. The reason I say this is that a significant part of my extended family is furious because of what I did. And they would say things like, Harsh, we are ashamed of you because after all that we suffered in partition, you've gone and taken the wrong side. And my answer to them is that after all that we suffered in partition, who better than us can understand what it means to be targeted because of your religion and identity? So I'm standing with those who are being targeted today in my country for their religion and identity. So it is I who am on the right side. It's you who are on the wrong side. And it's a conversation I wish repeatedly to have in Israel and Palestine. Uh, you know, uh, you what the Jewish people suffered, how can they do this to another people?
Yeah. And a lot of the Holocaust survivors are the ones that are actually saying that same thing.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, just incredible just hearing your story, Dr. Harsh. And so just going back, if the BJP, you mentioned the thing around the 33% of the vote. Now, the question I have is this. If I was to play devil's advocate, and we know that the Babri issue happened
Yes.
whilst Congress was in power, it could be argued that the BJP are far worse when they're not in power. Like, for example, they were not in power in the state of Delhi when the Delhi riots happened. Muzaffarpur, another example. It seems like they use violence when they're not in power a lot more than when they are empowered.
It, it,
What are
it's
your thoughts on that?
it's an interesting argument, and it's a thoughtful question as well. It's what the BJP RSS often say. They say that Gujarat is much safer after the massacre because you don't see overt, violence of that kind or scale. It's a hugely problematic idea. Every single episode of, and this word communal riot and communal violence, maybe it's a very peculiarly South Asian usage, because communal in the UK, for instance, is considered a good thing. The community coming together. So, but it's a peculiar term which we use for religious violence that is, between religious communities. Um, and that's what, why does communal violence happen? Uh, and I've I've worked in many capacities. As a civil servant, you're the head of a district. I've handled the 84 riots and the riots that happened during the whole Babri Masjid period. In 2002, I quit the civil service and I worked for a long time with the victims of that violence. I worked, as a human rights worker, as a peace worker, and I've also studied communal violence very closely. So in all of these three capacities, I've realized that the word riot is actually an inappropriate word to use, because the word, I don't think after partition was riots, where people spontaneously slaughtered each other. What we're seeing now, uh, we very rarely see riots. what we're seeing, there are three, uh, very briefly, there are three necessary uh, conditions before communal violence breaks out. The first of them is what I call the manufacture of hatred. Hatred does not spontaneously exist. After all, uh, India or the subcontinent, which also includes Pakistan and Bangladesh today, uh, are are places where it's the only civilization which has had this level of every major religion came here, and instead of moving on, as Maulana Azad used to describe, instead of moving on, all the caravans just stayed on here and made this, and that's what makes us a pretty unique civilization. Amartya Sen, in a recent interview, was saying that at the very time that the Spanish Inquisition was happening, and people were being burnt at the stakes because of their religious identity in Europe, we had an emperor called Akbar who was inviting people of every faith, and he was trying to build, uh, the idea of religious tolerance at that, exactly in those years. So there is something that is, that the people of this land have lived with respect, with this way of equal respect, recognizing that there are many paths to the Almighty, and you must respect all of them. The uh, uh, the BJP, and so first, the first is the manufacture of hatred. Sorry, I lost that string. And the manufacture of hatred is something that is done very systematically by, and almost every study reveals the role of the RSS as being central to every major riot in terms of the creation of hatred. you know and it take me a long time. I can take example. So you spread rumors. So even let's put aside the Muslim question. 1984, yes, Mrs. Gandhi was killed by two Sikh bodyguards, but the story that was sort of spread was that Sikhs were celebrating her killing across the country, and they needed to. It was a complete lie. But it led to one of the biggest massacres that we've seen in this very city in Delhi. So there's a manufacture of hatred which is done by organizations dedicated to creating hatred. The second is the logistics of the violence. I mean, you don't suddenly have, it's not spontaneously that you can slaughter 4,000 people or 3,000 people. I mean, you have voter lists, you have weapons, you have chemicals, you have, all sorts of materials to implement. It's like a war. So the manufacture of hatred, the creation, I mean, the planning of the logistics of this violence. And one of the finest scholars of criminal violence in India is an American social scientist called Paul Brass. He's no longer alive, and he talked about riot producing machineries. And he's documented exactly what I've been talking about. But these are necessary but not sufficient. So let me ask you, Obeys, what is the third? You have both of these. These are necessary, but if the third doesn't happen, the first two will not still produce communal violence. What is the third?
Enacting, I guess, or
The
no.
supportive and enabling role of the state.
Oh yes, of course, yeah.
I mean, if the state does not want communal violence to happen, it will not happen. I've handled riots. I know, even as a very young officer, I was posted in a place called Indore when the Sikh riots happened. We were, I was determined to not let it, and we stopped it in a matter of, it was a very huge communal slaughter. I stopped it within about 6 hours. During the Babri Masjid time, stopped it in less than an hour. But when it goes on for days and days, it can only happen because the state wants it to happen.
Yeah.
So the manufacture of hatred, the logistics, and the planning of the violence itself are necessary conditions, but necessary and sufficient is a state which wants the violence to happen. And therefore, non-Congress governments, non-BJP governments uh, have a great deal to account for in history for not uh, for not uh, for not controlling the violence, which they have the capacity to do. But but it's a huge danger when people say, therefore, what is the difference between the BJP and, say, the Congress party?
Yeah.
See, for the BJP, it is their ideology. With the Congress, it is the betrayal of their ideology. And but the BJP, RSS only exists on the basis of this ideology. They can't be different. The Congress has, you know, Nehru's the years was the best time in terms of communal peace, and as subsequent, there have been, subsequent governments which have compromised uh, criminally with with their ideology, which is the ideology of the constitution where everybody has equal rights and equal protection. For the BJP, this is their ideology,
Yeah.
and therefore we need to fight uh, the BJP because it is pushing us in a direction which I see very close to where Nazi Germany reached. Uh,
I mean,
but but I just say one more thing,
yeah.
about look at your own country, look at the UK, look at the US. The parties which are supposed to be fighting the far right are don't seem to have the courage of their convictions. They sound, I mean, look at Germany. Merz, who's going to become the chancellor, his position on immigration was almost as bad as the far right. Listen carefully to Kamala Harris again. What she was saying on immigration, on Gaza, on a number of things was not really dissimilar. She just was more presentable than Donald Trump. So look at your own country. Labour is more and more sounding like the Tories.
Conservatives. Yeah.
So what I'm saying is that uh, the center left has increasingly, not just in my country, but in yours and in many countries around the world, have increasingly uh, betrayed and violated their core ideological position, which is equal rights for minorities, uh, uh, a state which stands with the poor and the working classes, a redistributive state, etc., etc. That's the ideology of the Labour Party. That's the ideology of the Congress. That's the ideology of the Democrats. How much are each of them sort of violate? Where's the conviction that they have? And therefore, the rise of the far right in all of these countries, there is a great responsibility actually for the center left for not having stood with what they believe in, with the conviction that they needed to have.
I'm very grateful that you went through this because this is a big issue for us in the UK.
Mhm.
But I'm very glad you've drawn the distinction around the fact that where with Labour or with Congress, it is not their raison d'etre. It's not their reason for being. Whereas actually with the BJP,
Absolutely,
that's the
you
issue.
got me exactly. And therefore, you can
Yeah.
still fight them to stay
Yes.
with their ideology. You can't fight the BJP, RSS,
Yeah.
or the far right in other countries because that is their ideology.
Yeah. And I hope that my friends and colleagues in the UK are listening into this carefully because, of course, there's a big attempt right now, especially within the Muslim community, to affiliate themselves with the BJP in whatever capacity. And the playbook that the BJP are using is, hey, there wasn't any violence, when we hear, that kind of stuff. But hopefully we've cleared and alleviated that, and we've
And let me
yeah,
just say one more thing. Gujarat is not is a terribly violent place. Violence is not just when blood spills on the streets. Violence is where you live with fear, where you're pushed into ghettos, where people boycott you, where you're frightened. I mean, I've been trying to bear witness and document this over the last many months in a column that I write, which actually I call Bearing Witness in school. And if you read an earlier column, I talked about where prayer has become a crime.
yeah, so that.
When you're attacked, the first instance I give there is of a woman in a public hospital. Somebody is very sick, and she performs the namaz, for his survival. And people say that this is a crime. and this is increasingly happening. So violence, I don't agree at all. I feel that in places that are ruled by the BJP, Muslims are living with great fear, as a day-to-day way of life, and simply a change in government. Karnataka is a place which really had become very badly polarized. The Congress came to power, and everybody tells me that somehow everything changed, almost overnight. Not that the Congress is doing great work, is standing, but this ideological battle of hate, this normalization of hate, this valorization of hate, that came down.
Absolutely. Dr. Harsh, I just wanted to thank you once again because I know it's so late in India right now. I don't want to keep you too much longer. I just have one question to ask. Because I have seen roots of optimism in your speeches sometimes. I've seen towards the end you make some comments which fills me with optimism. So, where do you see the future outlook for minorities, especially Muslims in India, and what roots of optimism can you see in that? Yeah.
You know, in this one respect, when I compare India and what's happening in the US, um, in the US, they say that if you are white, there's a greater chance you'll be voting Trump. But if you're white with a university degree, the chances are much lower. In India, the peculiar thing is that if you're upper caste Hindu, high chance that you're voting BJP. But if you're upper caste Hindu with a university degree, even higher chance. If you're upper caste Hindu in a university degree in the most sort of elite centers of learning, the IITs, for instance, or the IIMs, etc., even higher chance. So, so rich and middle class Indians are not holding on to that idea of India. They are the ones who are most plugging into this uh, ideology of hate. It is working class Indians who still uh, give me hope. They live. I mean, they will not give you speeches on pulpits about Hindu Muslim unity, but they live it. Just recently, I mean, a couple of weeks ago, we had the great Mahakumbh, where it's estimated. I don't know. The numbers are just mind-boggling, but they claim something like 400 million people went, etc. There were stampedes, and you read reports of where did they get shelter after the stampede was in the mosques. And and I see these stories lived out all the time. Ordinary Indians still live with far greater respect and acceptance of people of the other community, and that is what gives me hope. I still believe that. Uh, Somebody asked me, what is the who would I regard as the quintessential Indian? And I'll tell you, it'll be a woman who comes out of her home in a shanty slum. She walks down the road. She sees a mosque and she bows her head. She goes a little further. She sees a church and she bows her head. She goes a little further. She sees a gurdwara and she bows her head. She goes a little further and she sees a Hindu temple and she bows her head. I have not seen this woman anywhere else in the world. And I believe that that Indian will still prevail.
Dr. Harsh, on that note, I won't add any more. I just wanted to thank you so much. We would love to get you again at UK-IMC at an event, hopefully in person. But thank you once again for giving us your time and giving us hope. That's the most important thing.
Thank you. Pleasure to talk
Thank
to
you.
you. And when other young people from your country listen to this, I'd be happy to be reaching out to them.